Imagine, Norwich sorting office, a sweltering July morning in 1959, a scene about to change forever. A man is sitting at a keyboard that seems out of place in a post office. In front of him is a tray of letters. In his left hand is an envelope, and above the address are 6 characters that nobody in Britain had needed to write a year earlier. He reads them, he types them. The movement is simple and repetitive, yet an entire new postal system depends on it. The envelope moves on, carrying something it did not have a moment before, a short line of small printed dots running across the paper. Those dots are the point of this story. Not the code, the dots. Because the code was not originally written for the postman who would eventually carry the letter to a door. A postman already had what he needed: a street, a house number, and a town. The new characters were meant for a machine, yet the machine could not read them, not directly, not as letters and numbers written on an envelope. It could read only what the operator at the keyboard turned them into. The future of British letter sorting therefore began with a contradiction. Before a machine could reduce human labour, a person first had to translate every address into a language the machine understood. By October, every private address and business in Norwich was due to have a code. Around 150,000 addresses would be asked to use one. Norwich would become the first British city in which a complete modern postcode experiment reached the public. The post office was asking an entire city to learn a small piece of machine language and add it to every letter it sent. But the true question that summer wasn't just about public cooperation. It was whether this gleaming new machinery could truly earn it. To understand why the General Post Office believed that machinery was necessary, it helps to enter the room it hoped to change. For generations, letter sorting was a skill carried in the head. A sorter stood before a wooden frame filled with pigeonholes and worked through a bundle by hand. Read, place, release. Read, place, release. Each movement took little more than a second, but the speed came from years of memory. A trained sorter was a living map. He knew streets, districts, and delivery office boundaries. He knew which towns shared a name, and when the county was the only clue that separated them. He recognized abbreviations, imperfect handwriting, and addresses that were technically incomplete but still clear to an experienced eye. A house name, a local landmark, or a familiar firm could be enough. There was an elegance to it. The sorter's hands appeared to move without hesitation because the difficult part had already happened. Thousands of routes and exceptions had been learned. The machinery of the sorting office was not only the frame or the bags or the dispatch times, it was the accumulated knowledge of the people standing at those frames. But that knowledge was also fragile. It took years to build, and it remained inside one person. When an experienced sorter retired, some of the organization's geography walked out of the building with him. A replacement could be trained, but memory could not be installed overnight. After the Second World War, the pressure increased. Britain was sending more letters, and the volume continued to rise. The GPO, which then ran both the postal service and the telephone system, could see the arithmetic ahead. More letters required more sorters. More sorters required more frames, more training, and more floor space. The work still had to fit between the last collections at night and the first deliveries in the morning. A delay inside a sorting office did not remain inside the building. It followed the post onto trains, vans, and delivery rounds across the country. For a time, the old system absorbed the growth. Then the figures began to point towards a limit that recruitment alone could not remove. There were only so many skilled sorters the post office could train, only so much city centre floor space it could occupy, and only so many hours in the night. The organisation desperately needed a breakthrough, and so, with a mixture of hope and trepidation, it began to build machines. In the early 1950s, one proposed system acquired a name that sounded almost domestic: electronic letter sorting indicating equipment, ELSIE. The warmer name suggested the hope invested in the project. The title that later became more familiar was less charming but more exact: the single-position letter sorting machine. The machine appeared to offer a way out of the approaching bottleneck. Give each destination a short, fixed code. Let an operator key that code, convert it into a pattern the equipment could recognize. Then, allow the machine to direct the envelope into the correct box. It was an elegant idea, but it exposed the central obstacle immediately. A machine in 1959 could not read an ordinary address. The real problem was not simply weak machinery, it was the character of human writing. An address might be typed or handwritten, careful or hurried. It might include a house name instead of a number, shorten a county, misspell a town, or omit information that a skilled sorter could infer. Human inconsistency, which the Postal Service had quietly accommodated for generations, became a barrier to mechanization. The old world spoke in judgment and local knowledge. The new equipment required something fixed, short, predictable, and placed where an operator could find it. Before the post office could teach machinery to sort the public's letters, it had to teach the public to write addresses differently. Norwich was ultimately chosen as the place to cross this pivotal threshold, not for romantic ideals, but for cold, hard practicality. Its sorting office already contained 8 sorting machines that could be adapted so an operator could key a code directly into the system. Beginning elsewhere would have required the post office to construct the experiment almost from nothing. In Norwich, much of the equipment was already standing on the floor. That made the city suitable, but it did not make the decision safe. A workshop trial could be stopped, adjusted, and repeated. Giving codes to an entire city was different. The experiment would leave the engineering department and enter kitchens, offices, address books, business stationery, and the daily habits of ordinary people. Once 150,000 addresses had been told to change, the post office could no longer pretend it was testing only a machine. The Norwich format contained 6 characters, the letters N, O, and R, followed by a space, 2 digits, and 1 final letter. A code might look like NOR9N. The 2-digit section could begin with 0, unlike the later national format, and there was only 1 letter at the end, where the postcode familiar today has 2. The result looked recognizable, but was not yet the code Britain would eventually adopt. It was close enough to suggest the future, and different enough that Norwich would later have to surrender it. Larger organizations could receive individual codes. Norwich City Football Club, for example, was assigned NOR22T. But the code's most important journey was not onto a large firm's stationery. It was through the letterbox of an ordinary house. At the domestic end, the whole project depended on a leaflet and a request. Residents were told their new code and asked to include it in their address. There was no penalty for leaving it out. An uncoded letter would still be collected, still be sorted by hand, and still be delivered. From a householder's perspective, this was a peculiar bargain. An address that had served perfectly for decades was suddenly, inexplicably, deemed incomplete. A person was asked to remember an unfamiliar string of characters, write it on every envelope, and perhaps tell distant relatives and businesses to use it as well. The code had no obvious meaning to the writer. It existed to help an unseen machine solve a problem belonging to the post office. It was not an unreasonable request, but it was an act of civic trust. The system rested on thousands of people, accepting a small inconvenience without being forced. Engineering could print the dots and direct the envelopes. It could not manufacture that trust. Once a coded envelope reached the sorting office, the intended process was precise. At the coding position, the operator read the postcode and keyed it. Inside the equipment, the instruction was translated into binary form, a pattern with 2 states, mark and no mark. Through phosphor tape, that pattern was printed onto the envelope as a line of dots. The envelope then carried 2 versions of the same instruction. At the top was the address written for people in ink. Below was a second address written for machinery in dots. The same letter had effectively been addressed twice in 2 languages, and only one version had been supplied by the sender. The envelope traveled along a conveyor towards the sorter. A reader detected the dots, and the machinery sent the letter into its destination box without reading the handwritten address in any human sense. That was the promise of the system. The postcode did not remove reading, it moved the reading to an earlier point. A person at a keyboard became the translator between the city and the machine. The technology did not yet replace human understanding. It reorganized where that understanding was used. On paper, the chain worked. In a controlled run, each stage could be followed and explained. But public confidence would not be won by a diagram. The post office needed people to see the machine working and believe that adding the code was worth the trouble. By the middle of July, 1,000 959, the Norwich experiment was ready for a national demonstration. Tuesday, 28 July, would be the decisive morning. The Postmaster General, Ernest Marples, was coming to the sorting office. Newspapers and photographers would be there. The equipment would no longer be judged only by engineers and postal staff. It would perform before the people whose reports could define the experiment for the rest of the country. Marples was the government minister responsible for the post office, an office with substantial authority in 1959. He would later become much better known for his work on Britain's roads. But in Norwich, his task was to launch a new postal system and persuade the public to take part. The engineering had already been done, the machines were installed, addresses were being coded, and the decision to proceed had been made. The demonstration was about belief. A leaflet could tell residents to write NOR 22T. A visible machine sending a letter to the correct box could show them why. The hall was prepared. The audience began to arrive. Norwich's head postmaster, John Fryer, was responsible for the floor and for ensuring that the carefully arranged chain performed as promised. Then, just as the murmurs of the arriving audience began to settle, Fryer received the devastating news. A critical conveyor belt, the very heart of the system, had failed. It was not the keyboard, the printer, or the sorting mechanism. It was the conveyor linking the keyboard and printer unit to the machinery beyond it. Each end of the process could still work, but a letter could not travel from the first end to the second. It was a small mechanical failure with complete consequences. The point of the demonstration was the chain. A coding unit working alone proved little. A sorter operating alone proved little. The audience had come to see one envelope complete the whole journey. There was not enough time to make the repair. The Postmaster General was in the building. The national press was taking its place. Calling off the event would turn a broken belt into the day's only story. Fryer was trapped between a machine he believed could work and a demonstration that now could not. The city had already been assigned its codes. The decision had already been made in London. Yet the evidence placed before the public was about to fail because of one disconnected belt. What followed was not an engineering repair. It was a human improvisation. Before the demonstration began, staff had time to run about 100 letters through the keyboard and dot printing unit. Those envelopes were correctly coded and correctly marked. They were then removed and placed behind the equipment. Two postmen took up positions out of the audience's view. The demonstration started. Marples spoke beside the machinery. The operator sat at the coding position and keyed the first letter. The front conveyor, visible to the audience, worked normally. Envelopes passed through the printer and entered the machine. Behind it, where the broken connection could not be seen, the two postmen lifted those newly coded letters away. They substituted the prepared envelopes and fed them into the working sorter at the other end. The audience saw letters enter the system. It saw letters fall into the correct destination boxes, but they were not the same letters. Everything on either side of the gap was genuine. The coding was genuine. The dots were genuine. The final sorting was genuine. What was not genuine, for roughly 100 envelopes on that one morning, was the journey through the middle. No one in the audience had reason to suspect it. The disconnected machinery ran more quietly than a fully working system, and the quietness was reportedly taken as evidence of its sophistication. Remarkably, a telltale symptom of failure had, by sheer human ingenuity, become an integral part of the impression of success. The incident is preserved in the Postal Museum's account of the experiment, and it deserves careful description. It was not proof that the entire project was false, nor evidence of a permanent policy of deception. It was a head postmaster and his staff, faced with a broken belt and no time to repair it, arranging a substitute sequence so the public launch could continue. For Fryer, there was no clean choice. Cancel the demonstration and allow a minor fault to discredit machinery that could work, or stage the missing connection and protect the larger experiment. His solution saved the morning, but it also revealed something the post office could not mechanize away. When the system reached its moment of greatest pressure, it still depended on people. The launch was reported as a success. That was the experiment's immediate reward: public proof, favorable attention, and time to continue. But it was a temporary victory. The broken chain had been hidden, not repaired, and the deeper problems were waiting outside the demonstration hall. In the fraught weeks that followed, the machines predictably continued to break down Lesson 1. But a second, far more profound lesson emerged. Fewer than half of the letters posted in Norwich actually bore the new code. This was not a dramatic revolt. It was the quiet resistance of habit. People wrote addresses as they had always written them, because those addresses still worked. An uncoded letter would simply return to the manual frames. The new system, therefore, had to coexist with the old one. That destroyed the simplicity of the promised saving. If only part of the mail arrived coded, the machines could sort only that part. The frames still had to remain. Skilled sorters still had to remain. Floor space and staffing could not disappear when almost half the post continued to follow the traditional route. Some objections were more direct. Postcards were sent to the Postmaster General complaining about the extra characters and the extra effort, particularly when the price of posting a letter had recently risen. The Post Office kept those objections, preserving the public side of the experiment in its archive. Then came the third lesson. The code itself was not precise enough. The final 3 characters did not divide the city as finely as the future system required. Norwich had been asked to memorize a format that could demonstrate the principle but could not become the final national answer. So the trial ended without a simple verdict. It was not a failure because it proved that coded sorting could work. It was not a success because the machines were unreliable. Public participation was too low and the code needed redesigning. Norwich had shown that the central idea was possible while almost everything surrounding it remained unready. The Post Office returned to the problem with knowledge it had not possessed before. Mechanization was not only a matter of constructing machinery. It required a code detailed enough for the task, equipment dependable enough for daily use, operators trained to translate the code, and millions of citizens willing to change a familiar habit. It took 6 years for the next major step. In October 1965, a different Postmaster General, Tony Benn, announced that postal coding would be extended across the country. The national program began at Croydon in 1966 and proceeded region by region, city by city, and address by address. It took 8 years to complete. The delay was a measure of how much of the problem had never been purely technical. A national postcode had to be built into sorting offices, business records, household stationery, and public memory. It had to become so ordinary that people stopped seeing it as machine language and began seeing it as part of where they lived. In 1974, the final area was brought into the national system. That place was Norwich. The first city to receive the experimental codes became the last to be converted to the permanent format. Its original Nor codes, used for 15 years on forms, bills, address books, and Christmas cards, were withdrawn. The city that had crossed the threshold first had to cross it again. There is a quiet cost in that change. For a generation, Nor, followed by 2 digits and a letter, had become part of the city's written identity. Then the trial language disappeared, replaced by the more precise system its successes and failures had helped to create. This brings us back to the operator at the keyboard in July 1959, reading 6 characters and turning them into dots. His job sat between 2 postal worlds. Behind him was the sorter whose memory held streets, districts, and exceptions. Ahead was machinery that demanded standard instructions before it could act. The lesson from Norwich is not that machines replaced people. At first, mechanization issued instructions to them. It instructed the operator to translate a human address into coded marks. It instructed postal workers to reorganize long-established skills. It instructed every household and business to add new characters to an address that had worked before. The public wasn't merely observing the machine. By the simple act of changing how they wrote, they literally became one of the machine's most crucial and often overlooked working parts. That pattern reaches far beyond the postal service. New technology often arrives with the promise that it will perform work for us. Before it can do so, it asks us to standardize something, label something, or change a habit. The machine may be new, but the first stage of automation is frequently human adaptation. If you remember receiving one of Norwich's original Nor codes, or if an older postcode format once appeared in your family's address book, share that detail in the comments. Those small memories show what official records cannot. How a national system entered ordinary homes, one envelope at a time. Because the machines did arrive, and eventually they worked properly. But they did not begin with a machine reading an address. They began with a city learning to write for one.